It's the beginning of a new year, and it's freezing cold, and a drop in temperature in history can mean only one thing. That's right, a Cold War. So today, for this special episode of Mr. Keet on Location, we're going to be reviewing an historical board game that charts the period known as the Cold War, the clash of the two superpowers, the USA and the USSR. So for this episode, I've even gone so far as to create my own Cold War period nuclear bunker. So follow me and we'll go and film the episode in there. The year is 1945, and you are about to participate in one of the greatest struggles known in the history of mankind. One player is going to assume the role of the USA and her forces of capitalism, spreading her influence around the globe. The other player is going to assume the communist forces of the USSR. The aim of the game is to be the first side to achieve 20 victory points, which is done through spreading your influence around the globe, all the while avoiding the catastrophe of nuclear war as the DEFCON meter descends and potentially sends the world into nuclear chaos. The game is played out on the board using a system of influence markers, the blue representing the capitalist spendthrift West, the red representing the socialist values of the USSR. Each round, both players are going to be dealt a hand of 8 or 9 cards, and this hand is going to be your goldmine of events in the Cold War to benefit your side. As America, you can send money spiralling across Europe in the form of martial aid to get people on your side. You can even create the CIA to keep a watch on your own citizens. Over on the Russian side of the table, you might want to go and blockade Berlin to make sure that any foreign currency doesn't intervene and undermine your economy in the East. Or you can form the Warsaw Pact to keep those pesky Eastern European countries in line. Don't fancy playing the event? Well then fine, you can play the card for its numerical value. This is its number of operations points, which allow you to conduct a number of covert operations around the globe. The purpose of this is to spread your influence around the globe, and just like in the real Cold War, there are 3 ways of doing this in the game of Twilight Struggle. One way is to simply place a marker down on that country to show your influence growing inside it, whether it be through grain sales or harsher, meaner means of invasion. Secondly, using a roll of the dice, you may decide to reduce your opponent's influence in the country that you want to dominate. Finally, and perhaps most dangerously, you might decide to launch a coup, and while this may have the instant result of shifting the country to favour your political side, it may also have dangerous repercussions if it goes wrong, and political consequences which push the world ever closer to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. And if this weren't enough, there's also a catch. Let's say, for example, I am America, and I've been dealt the Warsaw Pact, which is not going to benefit me at all because it's a military alliance between Russia and her allies in Eastern Europe. If I play this event, it's going to gain me a great number of operations points, which are going to be helpful to me in spreading my influence around the world, but the event still occurs and benefits the Russian player. What this quickly results in is a fast-paced game of political tennis, a wily Wimbledon tournament, where you and your opponent are both striving to obtain as much influence in the world as you possibly can. You've launched a coup in Iran to oust my puppet dictator? That's fine, I will invade Vietnam. Or perhaps that's not such a good idea. Now this is important because sooner or later you or your opponent is going to deal one of the scoring cards. And what this means is that that region of the board, in this case Europe, is going to be tallied up in terms of the total influence that you and your opponent have. The person with the most influence is going to gain the most victory points, and the person with the most victory points is going to win the Cold War. But what we haven't talked about yet is one of the greatest things about this game, which is its theme. So it takes us through each stage of the Cold War as it unfolds. By the middle of the game, when we get to the mid-war, we start to get events appearing such as America exerting its force over the Middle East, or some kind acts of Russian diplomacy. And by the end of the game, we get to see the guy that appears on t-shirts across the world, as well as Space Marines. China is even represented in the form of the Chinese Civil War with a card ironically called the China card. Each time this is played by a certain side, it then switches over to the other side to represent China being an uncertain ally during the whole of the Cold War period. As the game progresses, different parts of the world also become locked up in terms of what you can do in them to represent the different phases of the Cold War as well. So as the DEFCON meter, the threat of nuclear war gets ever closer to exploding and destroying the world. Coups and realignments are no longer allowed in Europe, then Asia, then the Middle East. So by the end of the game, just like the last phases of the Cold War, you end up playing for different parts of the world than those with which you started competing in. Even the space race is represented on the board, and if you don't like one of the cards that you've received each round, you can put it as a resource towards your quest to the stars. The benefit being that the first person to reach the first satellite or the first dog, even the first man on the moon or the first space station in orbit around the Earth receives a certain benefit, which is then denied to the opposite player. However, I do have one or two criticisms about Twilight Struggle, as well as mentioning the great things here in this review. The first may be a little strange, but if you're new to Twilight Struggle, you're going to want to play it with someone who's new to the game as well. This is because this is probably the closest that modern board games get to the ancient game of chess, in that if your opponent has memorised a certain opening or even knows the cards well, and believe me, there are people that do that, there are tournaments of this that take place around the world, then they're going to have a distinct advantage over you in how the game progresses. The other criticism is the length of the game. You're not going to be able to play this game through the entire Cold War unless you've got a free afternoon or a free evening, because a standard game of Twilight Struggle takes 3 to 4 hours, even for experienced players. If you're learning the game, potentially even longer than that. Although the box's estimate of the game length may be a little overstated, you may need to do some covert influencing yourself in order to convince someone to sit down and play through the whole of the Cold War period with you. Overall, however, if you've got 3 to 4 hours to spare on an afternoon or an evening and a good friend to spend it with, then I can thoroughly recommend Twilight Struggle. In what other game can you throw down the Cuban Missile Crisis in front of your opponent and almost throw the world into nuclear turmoil? In what other game, as the USSR, can you slap down an event that says you shot down their U-2 spy plane and throw the US government into chaos? The whole game is saturated in the theme of the period, and what's more, almost every event is explained thoroughly in its context in the back of what is a thoroughly detailed manual. So, if you enjoy the Cold War and you enjoy board games, then go and buy Twilight Struggle, and I will promise you an afternoon or an evening of Cold War excitement. Wait a minute, we better go and investigate what that is. It's the KGB. What are you doing here? The Cold War's over.
No, it's only just begun.